Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us. And welcome to today's webcast, The New Frontier in Global Logistics Technology, linking customer expectations to customer promise, presented by the Journal of Commerce, part of the Maritime and Trade Division of IHS Markit. I'm Eric Johnson, Senior Technology Editor with the JOC, which is part of the Maritime and Trade Division at IHS Markit, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. Joining me today are Jim Blazer, Director at Alex Partners, Simon Kaye, CEO of Jaguar Freight Services, and Brian Morgan, Director of Engineering and Product International Supply Chain at Wayfair. So why are we discussing this particular topic today? Well, let's think back. Let's think about the last 12 months in supply chain. All the long-term trends that we were seeing around the movement of global freight seemed to accelerate during the COVID pandemic. More e-commerce sales, more decentralized B2B coordination of logistics, higher end consumer expectations. All of this has coalesced around what has been called the customer promise date. Not just consumer, but even heightened expectations between commercial customers and internal customers. And so we'll examine these dynamics through the lens of the opportunities and challenges that technology presents to help shippers and their service providers navigate this really complicated landscape. So a real quick rundown on our format today. In a second, I'm going to pass things over to Jim to walk us through some level-setting slides that he's worked up for us. And then for the rest of the time, we'll do a roundtable discussion with our three experts. Great.
Thanks, Eric.
So now I'm going to pass things over to Jim. Sorry, Jim, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I appreciate the kind introduction. So Eric asked me to join today to just maybe set the table a little bit about what we see going on in the marketplace related to this customer promise issue and sort of backing that out into supply chain issues, costs, customer service requirements, and the like. So we put together a few slides here just to sort of set the table. These I think are available for download if you like them. Always happy to answer any more questions or have some discussion offline about these as well. So just moving forward here, I don't have to spend much time on this slide. I think anybody who's dialed into this webcast knows that transportation costs in the last year has gone up significantly. We've seen this across all modes. We've seen it sort of more acutely in certain modes at certain times, but just as a general statement, transportation costs more this year than it did last. And it probably cost more last year than it did the year before. So that's a trend that we're spotlighting here and something I think you're all acutely aware of. It's not really the substance of today's call, though. Today, it's really more of just the backdrop for one of these issues here. What I think is interesting to put that up against here is and we use this one question from our survey as sort of a barometer for customer demand. But at the same time, transportation costs has become more expensive. Customers, generally speaking, have become more demanding. The measure we're using here is in terms of how many days are consumers willing to wait for a shipment that would be delivered to them for free. So obviously just one angle, very consumer-oriented, but something that we use sort of as a barometer. And you can see over time, since we've been studying this fact or this trend, customers have expected now their shipments to come probably 50% faster almost than they used to in the past is what the sort of acceptable window is for a free shipment. And obviously we see at the same time more demands for customers to not only get shipments faster, also to get them free, but also to get them within more sort of specified, defined windows. You can't just say like, we'll show up sometime next week anymore. It's really more about like, well, not just one day, but what time window can we have for home delivery or even in the business-to-business setting, deliveries of not for resale goods. So overall, I guess the picture we wanted to set here is supply chains have become more expensive from the freight side, but they've also become sort of harder and more specific to manage from the customer demand point of view. And where does that materialize? Like how do you balance the two of those? Because those obviously are two sort of competing trends that shippers, many of you on the line today, have to manage. Well, in our view, it materializes often in inventory. And so one of the things that we wanted to also point out here, over the last 10 years, we've been looking at inventory turns as a measure of inventory, levels or the effectiveness in turning inventory across, a few sectors. Largely, we've looked at Amazon, and then we look at a sort of a composite of a few other groups here, big box retailers, retail and apparel groups. What I think is interesting in this, and it says there's a little bit of commentary in the margin here, what we're tracking really is the Amazon effect. Amazon has come in and broadly driven a higher expectation for consumer delivery, integrity, speed, and track and trace capabilities. They've also driven a larger expectation of availability, and obviously the free delivery aspect of it as well. What has happened in parallel to that is Amazon, in our view, has really driven other companies sort of into an inventory ditch, right? To compete with them, you have to add more inventory, put it closer to the customer, which means more distribution points, which typically means more inventory to make sure that you maintain buffer stock and can fulfill on orders, right? So I think that the background that we're really trying to stretch or to lay out here is costs have increased for freight, customer demands have increased, and what we've seen generally in these retail consumer settings is sort of, again, a barometer for what's going on more broadly, is that inventory, companies are carrying more inventory, turning it more slowly to compete. One interesting phenomenon you can see in this chart that we updated for this presentation, Amazon's turns sort of shot back up to where they were in the past. Largely we think that was driven by pandemic era shopping habits, but also through the acquisition and really ramp up of Whole Foods and Amazon really penetrating more of a faster turn market that they had historically in the past. But the longer term trend really, in my mind, shows, Amazon was willing to cut turns, and what they did in the process is they caused everybody else in the market to hold more inventory and really more costs. And so what we're outlining here sort of is a tightrope that shippers like you on the phone have to walk. Historically, up until the last, 10 or 20 years, or for the last 10 or 20 years, I should say, shippers have really been pressed to drive their supply chains longer and further, more globally, to tap into lower sources of supply, lower labor cost areas, lower production sources. And at the same time, you've also been pressed to drive your service levels higher. And the reality is that a long supply chain with high service level requirements are sort of fundamentally opposed to low cost and low inventory models. Only when, and I think that really became more apparent in the last year, when supply chains effectively broke through the pandemic, you could see that stress layout where a long supply chain with a high service level requirement, when you're trying to do that on a low cost, low inventory basis, you are walking a tightrope. And all it takes is, I shouldn't say all, I shouldn't minimize it. It took a global pandemic to knock many shippers off their tightrope, but it happened. What we laid out on some of the other sort of views here is just to give you a comparison. Typically, when we think about a long supply chain, if you're afforded the luxury of having lower service levels, you're sourcing a global commodity or something that, if you lose a container, there's 100 more behind it. You can afford to do that with less expensive freight because you're not so worried about the urgency or the integrity of the shipment. And you can often afford to do that with thinner inventory because of the size and scale of the operation. Whereas what we see now in sort of the post-pandemic era is the emergence of a rethinking of shorter supply chains, things that we thought about maybe before globalization. How can we have more supply locally, shorten our supply chain, increase our service level requirement, which I think really allows you to get a little bit of reprieve on freight cost conceptually, but it also requires you to drive higher inventory levels. So again, just a few permutations of how we see supply chains. But I think the overarching point that we wanted to make here was, shippers, Brian's going to talk a bit about this and Simon's going to talk about some of his customer experiences. But, shippers have to, before the pandemic, been walking this tightrope of a long supply chain with high service requirements, low freight costs, and low inventory. And those just really are not sort of factors or trends that can really coexist mathematically for a long period of time. But just thinking about what happened last year, and I mentioned this sort of sums up some of the things I just talked about, where, in a pre-pandemic environment, we had these sort of growth of supply chains that got very long, very lean, and frankly, very fragile, because they were done to drive out costs as well as maximize service. When we went into the pandemic era, sort of all bets were off, right? Your concern became less about supply integrity or on time. It became more about availability, or could I do this at all, right? And so you can see on the bottom in the middle column there, the overall pressures, financial and operational pressures became basically everything, right? And so it took this pandemic to knock supply chains off the tightrope that they've been walking for the previous 10 to 20 years of globalization. Looking forward, I think, and I put here post-pandemic, hopefully, in the green room before we were talking about who's got their shots. I'm proud to say I've got my first. I'm on my way to get my second. So I'm hopeful that we're emerging into a post-pandemic era. I don't know that that's necessarily the viewpoint of my firm or anything, just my own view. But as we look forward, I do hope that, supply chains, broadly speaking, will learn a bit from the pandemic, or learn a lot, and that the model that they were pressing before the pandemic, long supply chains, lean on inventory, lean on costs, high on service levels, is an extremely difficult, if not impossible, model to proliferate on a prolonged basis. And so I think what we'll see coming out of the pandemic is more shippers looking at sort of what I would call like a hybrid model, where maybe you look at your SKU assortment and think, how can I position high mover SKUs, things that are really critical to my customers in more shorter supply chain locations where I can fulfill faster, meet higher service requirements. But maybe then I look to get cost reprieve on some of my long tail SKUs or other items. So I think there's a lot to be said going forward for the role that technology is going to play, that more sort of, I think, thoughtful segmentation of your strategy and of your supply chain is going to play. And I think we're moving into an era where firms are going to think about, hey, what happened to me during the pandemic? How did I get caught short? How can I avoid that again? And make sure that I can go back and get low cost, low inventory wherever possible. But it's definitely, this has been a game changer, to say the least. One last slide that I'll offer here, just to give you, something maybe practical or pragmatic to hang your hat on. I've taken, I want to say at this point, it's probably more than 40, maybe approaching 50 calls from shippers ranging from, Gartner top 25 shippers to, relatively small companies that are all expressing the same concern. Like, freight prices are through the roof, my cargo is getting rolled, what can I do, right? And I think that, we published a report on this a couple weeks ago. I think that this is obviously a very critical moment for many supply chains to maintain continuity, but I think it's also a really excellent opportunity for shippers like Brian or others to sort of seize the moment, was the term we used, to make fundamental changes to your supply chain to make it easier to conduct business. Think about how you place urgency on your shipment. Does everything need to be an expedited shipment? And believe it or not, I've worked in environments where almost everything went expedited, right? And so, ask yourself some questions about service level, transit time. Can I make hard decisions around customer requirements that maybe make it easier for me to fulfill on this demand? Think about the dimensions of your freight. There may be some crazy packaging that you have that the customer says they need and can't do without. Well, maybe now the decision is, do you have the packaging or do you get your freight at all? And so there's some tougher decisions that I think you can push through. But I think more than anything, the fundamental issue that you want to get at is you're not going to get a lot of money out of your vendors in this market, right? Going to source freight from your carriers is probably not going to yield you the savings that you want to get. If you really want to get savings or more likely sort of cost mitigation and improve service levels in this environment, shippers really need to look inward and make some hard decisions around how they're managing their freight. And so we listed a few here on the page and some opportunities for immediate relief. But overall, just sort of in closing, before we pass off to the panelists here, I think that I hope that you took from this that the era of sort of the long supply chain, high service level, low freight cost, low inventory is probably a dangerous model for many companies to take forward. And I think this is the moment to really look at yourself, look at your supply chain, and think about how you can create a better model for your supply chain going forward, most likely into more of a hybrid solution based on mixing the best of both worlds, short and long supply chains, high and low service levels and the like. So Eric, I'm going to pass this back to you. There's a few slides in here just on sources, and of course, I came with my disclaimer, so I'll pass that one over. But hey, Eric, thanks again for having me. I look forward to the panel discussion here.
Great. So let's, it's time to bring Brian and Simon into our discussion. Brian, I wonder if you might kind of start us off with maybe a little description of your role within Wayfair. I don't think Wayfair needs much introduction at this point, but maybe what you're responsible for, and then maybe kind of follow up with kind of big picture, how you see sort of some of the challenges of meeting your customer expectations, and maybe go into exactly who your customers are.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks again for having me. I think, for me, I run the product and engineering group at Wayfair for our international supply chain. So, we're part of a larger logistics investment that Wayfair is making called our Castlegate Logistics Program. And so what we're doing, what my team is responsible for, is really providing the connective tissue and the software to give us complete visibility into managing and tracking the movement of goods all the way from factory, in our relationship with our shippers and the coordination with the factories, all the way into domestic warehouses for sale. And I think the big thing that we're doing in addition is, leveraging kind of overall consolidation on the origin side to hit some of those things that Jim mentioned in terms of do we need this product moved today? Do we need this product in this location today? Do we need this full container that happens to come out of this factory today? And being able to use our consolidation and the mix and match to prioritize the things that must get on a ship, that must get to a forward position because of availability, out of stock, customer promises, all of those type of things as we go. I think that was it. And then, in terms of the challenges that we're facing, I mean, I think it's the same thing everybody's facing, right? Like, how do you get a container on a ship? Like, that's the biggest problem today of how do you secure space? How do you secure space at a reasonable price? And then once it's moving, how does it actually deliver? And, it doesn't fall into the ocean or get stuck in the Suez Canal or whatever it happens to be, so that we can meet those customer promises.
Great. We'll dig into a lot more detail on that and sort of how you manage it, especially within the context of our discussion today. Simon, do you want to describe Jaguar and kind of what your customer base looks like and how that challenge has changed maybe over the last year for your customers?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks a lot. And I want to thank you, Eric, for inviting me onto the panel. And, great to be here with Jim and Brian. When I started Jaguar in 1993, 28 years ago, I realized very quickly that we weren't in the shipping and transportation business. We were in the information business. So we've always been focused on technology. Started with simple track and trace, evolved over the years and it's always been down to SKU level. So we understand the needs for our customers to know exactly what's coming, rather than there's a container coming, there's an air freight shipment coming, whatever. So that client perspective was always important and customer focus. But things have evolved over the years. So communication tool, document repository, analytics, which is huge today for our clients, and then PO management, something that love to talk about in a little bit. But I think that's, maybe not a silver bullet, but it's certainly a huge piece of the puzzle that everyone's trying to solve at the moment. Sort of upstream visibility. As far as the client base is concerned, so we have a mix of, mainly consumer packaged goods clients, a mix between mass and prestige. OTC drugs, cosmetics and health and beauty, food, promotional goods, and what I call sports outdoor living. So that's sort of broadly what our client base looks like, but largely they are direct to customer focused.
Sports and outdoor living seem to be very appropriate for the COVID age. So very interesting category of your customer base there. Well, cool. Definitely lots to ask, Simon. Brian, let me bring you back in, and maybe we can drill into some of those dynamics. There's the high level things that everybody is kind of watchful of right now. Certainly the capacity crunch, the container equipment kind of dislocation issue that almost every shipper is facing. The Suez thing, which literally happened in between us planning this and has been somewhat resolved before we even went live. But from your perspective, how are you coping with those kind of major all the way down to micro disruptions in the context of still needing to meet a specific date that you promise your internal customer, when a PO is cut or, whatever that kind of triggering point is upstream in your supply chain? How do you manage that with so many different disruptions happening kind of all the time?
So this is the, kind of standard challenges that everybody's facing today. I think the big thing for us is not only meeting external end customers, right? Like, I need this to show up on my doorstep, but our internal customers. So as being part of Wayfair, we have our own internal logistics network. We have our own warehouses. There's labor planning, all that kind of stuff that needs to be done. So, an ETA delay to departure, ETA delay to arrival at port, and then ultimately to the warehouse, that has a lasting ramification, right? So not only can the warehouses and the yards not plan for this capacity, they can't plan labor to unload this stuff, to put it into a location where it can actually be picked and sent to the customer. And so we're doing a lot of stuff on our side to increase our data visibility, getting information that we never had before, right? Like how many boats or how many vessels are sitting outside of the port of LA, right? Trying to predict, when are we next in line? When is this stuff going to actually show up? So that we can do that forward planning and ultimately allow those products to be able to move forward. I think we're also looking at just alternatives from the standard carriers that we've always worked for. Like, are there alternatives? Are there other ones that we can work with? Are there other modes or avenues we can take to expedite the movement of goods? Or, as I said, push things all the way up into the origin side and using consolidation so that we don't have to move all our containers. We just need to move the highest priority products themselves. And we can use a mix and match process on the origin side to be able to get through the things that we need to get through in the right amount of time.
Very cool. So Brian, let's kind of pick up where we were when we left off. When we were talking, when we were sort of prepping for our discussion, you mentioned something that I thought was quite interesting, which is some of the carrier partners and the way that they're sort of looking at the market on the carrier side is changing a bit. And you are starting to see them, I think the way you put it is you're starting to see them look for sort of serious long-term kind of partnerships or relationship. Can you kind of talk a bit about what that entails and how that might kind of bifurcate the market potentially?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, a lot of shippers like us, have been trying to look for a little bit of stability in this market as the rates have kind of gone up and down. And I think, Maersk is one of the partners that we have. There's recently an article on them that kind of matches our experience, which is, they're looking into much longer term relationships. So, instead of us fighting to get a 12-month term to try to get locked in from a volume and a price perspective, they're actually pushing for 2 to 3 year contracts where, there's rules in there around how the rates may change, but they want to build that long-term partnership. Right? They don't want to go and, as they say, they don't want to continue dating, right? They really want to settle down, find those partners, and be able to build a long-standing relationship where they get dedicated capacity and they can feel confident about the amount of volumes that are coming. And then as a shipper, we can feel good about the volumes that we can pump in and secure in any vessel. And so we're not out there continually in the spot market trying to fight to get the last container on a ship, but those things are available. I think at the end of the day, it's going to make it a little harder for the smaller guys who can't have those relationships. And so you might see them flocking much more towards freight forwarders or other larger, aggregators to some extent of that volume that are be able to have those conversations with the large carriers, but be able to push those things through. And so it'll be interesting to see exactly how the spot market plays out. I think in, foreseeable future with COVID demand, it's not going to change much, right? Like the capacity is going to be limited. There's not going to be a lot of stuff that overflows. And if anything, more capacity is going to be locked up in these relationships. But then coming out as, kind of returns to normal, that spot market, it's questionable how much that's going to loosen up versus being this kind of dedicated capacity with these long-term relationships.
Well, very interesting thoughts, and especially to see it kind of dovetailing with what a public message from obviously one of the more prominent carriers in the market has been saying. So we're about a half hour in. We haven't talked a lot about technology yet, but I think it was important to kind of set the stage and really kind of dig into the issues that maybe compel companies, whether you're a shipper or a service provider to a shipper, how you think about kind of meeting these external dynamics and translating those into an ability to better hone in on those promise dates. So Simon, you alluded a little bit to the way you sort of structured your business as not just the forwarder NVO, but kind of an information business. Can you elaborate on why you think sort of visibility and PO management are kind of the backbone of this, and what kind of goes into building that, your capability within those systems to be able to accurately predict when you're actually going to have your shipment to your customer?
Sure. So, as I said before, we've been focused on technology from the beginning. I jokingly say we're like a 28-year-old startup. We're just constantly evolving technology. It's always been or for a long time, the quest has been, what's coming and where is it, right? So what are the products that are coming towards me, and where are they? I don't want to say that nut has been completely cracked, but there is so many providers that are able to give that information today, that it is pretty much cracked. It's constantly being refined for sure. And I think Brian alluded to it with regards to the situations that we've had on the West Coast, particularly with vessels getting stacked up and when are they going to come in, and it's not just like an ETA into port. So there's definitely more information, and then where containers are on in the ports, when they're going to get pulled out, etc. But from our perspective, it's looking upstream in order to avoid, adjust, and mitigate issues downstream. And a big part of that is PO management, and obviously data. And I think a little bit of the holy grail here is data, and particularly clean data, right? We're all looking for clean data so we can analyze, so we can understand what's going on. And from our perspective, if you can get that data from source, which for us would be our client ERPs, right? So the stuff that's coming directly from their systems. And that's the original purchase order. So if you've got the original purchase order that you're communicating now with the overseas factories and managing and having visibility to the production process and when the cargo ready date is, you can plan considerably better. You can book well in advance, and to a good degree exactly what's going to be available. Because I think a lot of the challenges that shippers face is when goods are going to be available, how much capacity is required, when we need to make bookings. So from our perspective, PO management allows that view upstream in order to avoid issues downstream. It's been a big part of the success of a lot of our clients. And again, no silver bullet. And the last 12 months has been chaotic, as everyone knows. But it certainly mitigates the situation. And I've had more than one conversation with clients of ours that said that they've been in war rooms throughout the year discussing challenges. And on the list of challenges, much lower down the list has been the supply chain issues. They've got sourcing issues, up the wazoo. So stuff that, used to take 3 weeks lead times is now 12, 18, 20 plus week lead times from a production and raw materials issue. But supply chain, to a large extent, we've been able to mitigate with clients that use PO management. And I just think that view upstream, as I said before, allows you to manage things better downstream.
From my seat, we've seen this definite renaissance of PO management as a topic over the last year. It seemed like, Jim can remember this as well, but we were tracking this stuff, it seemed like 12, 15 years ago when the first and second generations of PO management were being offered. So it's really interesting. I guess it's back to that thing of what is old is new in technology in our space. And it's the newer infrastructure and architecture, I guess, that kind of enables it to maybe reach, is what Simon is saying kind of resonating with you in terms of the way you guys look at PO management?
So one of the things I was thinking about while Simon was speaking was, and this relates to that sort of the fundamentals of freight we talked about before. I think supply chain is so interesting because it's the area where all these sort of problems from other groups kind of come to roost, right? You get like, these challenges that come in from commercial and from manufacturing and sourcing. And as a supply chain manager, and this is one of the things I've heard so much lately is, I can't really control any of these things. I just have to sort of mitigate them. You can't be, you're just reactive. You're not really able to get out in front of them unless you have the ability to go upstream and drive, better decision-making processes. And PO management is one of the key areas that shippers can do that. And I think that's, where you're seeing a renewed interest there, right? It's pretty tried and true technology. The ROI case, I think, is really strong on PO management from a, international shipper standpoint. But it really, has to do with, the shipper's ability. Some of the things that Brian mentioned before about the way that they structure their supply chain organization and some of the control that they have over or input they have over some of those factors of the product and the service level. Like, that's not common, right? Like, I see, and that's obviously, I would say that's best practice and cutting edge, right? But it's not common amongst what I see in my customers. More often they're just, told, like, this is the service level, this is the source, these are the customer requirements and the dimensions. And I think what you're seeing in Wayfair and what you're hearing from Simon are, examples of shippers that are sort of taking control and shaping the outcome of their supply chain, as opposed to just sort of being the get it done, do it guys. That's so often what the supply chain is known for, is that, like, that firefighter culture, right? And I think these are great examples of where technology is enabling these folks to get out in front and be proactive.
Yeah, Brian, I would love your thoughts too on kind of where you see not just definitely on PO management, but I am interested in kind of hearing what basket of technologies that you need to run, these operations internally, and maybe also kind of highlight which metrics. You mentioned a couple before, but which metrics are kind of key to making sure that you're tracking where you need to be.
Yeah. I think what Jim and Simon hit on with PO management is huge, right? So one of the things that we see, right, is everything flows downstream. So if we don't have accurate ECRDs coming out of our factories, we're not going to get the capacity booked. We're not going to get things on. We're either going to have to, cancel late, pay fees, miss sailings, whatever it happens to be. And so from a technology perspective, that's one of the areas where we can invest in very heavily. Right now, we're working with, origin partners to collaborate with factories. But I think, as Simon said, getting those tools directly with the person who has the information. So working with a factory to understand, is there a slip? What is happening? Especially on the consolidation side, we see split shipments all the time. And so, all right, great, these products are coming out because they don't have room on the warehouse, on the factory floor, or, the products are available. That lets us start moving, right? We can get those products out, we can consolidate them with something else, and we can get those into sellable warehouses before everything gets done. And as you said, if you don't factor those things in, all you're doing is moving containers at that point in time. And so there's no prioritization and any of those things. From a tech perspective, to run the end-to-end supply chain, a lot of it is around integrations, getting that one view of what's going on. I think, oftentimes you have disparate systems providing you information, right? You have your order management system, you have transportation management, you have warehouse system. And so bringing that information together so that you can not only see, but be able to react to upstream changes. So when things change in terms of containers, right? Same thing I talked about before. We need to now update our labor planning in our warehouses because things are coming at different times, or we need to be able to go and clear out our yard. Maybe we need to go and pay some bobtail fees to get stuff out. Maybe we can't do even swaps anymore on that side, but bringing that visibility together, let us optimize that end to end. And then factoring in that service level up front, we can understand what things are we going to pay for to be expedited, right? Where we're going to limit the number of hops. Maybe we're going to limit or avoid a feeder vessel because it's going to increase our chances. Or when are we going to send stuff into consolidation because I want to run a full 40 versus a 20 because that 20 needs to get paired up with another 20 to go on rail, right? And so bringing all of that information together and then integrating not only with our systems internally, but integrating with all these third parties to have not only data, but accurate data, right? And so, on our supply chain, we interact with, we probably have for every data point at least 2, maybe 3 different sources that we're looking at. And sometimes they're better for one piece, sometimes they're better for another piece, but understanding holistically what that is. And in addition, also using that integration into terminals and ports and warehouses so that we can get real-time data around when is it available, when has it cleared customs, is there exception management, right? So has something been blocked from customs clearance and we need to go and operate on it? Or is it ready for us to tender out a DO and have a dray carrier come and pick those things up? So we're really trying to, use the technology to remove humans as much as possible And for the things that need a human touch, make them very transparent and bubble those things up in a task-driven or push model so that we can be optimally manage those exceptions and get those things flowing so that we don't have a huge amount of downstream implications as a result of those changes.
And maybe one more follow-up on the technology piece. How, and I'm not entirely sure how to characterize this question, but hopefully it's clear. How sort of centralized do you view your use and management of all the technologies that you need to kind of piece this all together? Do you sort of have a team that's sort of orchestrating this and using a backbone system with all these integrations? Or is it sort of by nature decentralized and you just sort of have to let different teams manage different systems? And how do you sort of piece that together if it's the latter?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's parts of it are split, right? So from a transportation perspective, for us, that's one system, right? And we're pulling data in from all these disparate distributed systems to get that unified view and then have that to be kind of like our control tower or a central orchestration where we can then interact with all these different systems, whether it's sending information down to the warehouses or we're sending information out to the carriers to say, hey, this needs to change. What's the ETA? What's happening with these particular things? But being able to bring it together and have that holistic end-to-end view versus looking at just like the vertical slices of whether it's origin, ocean, dray, or domestic, being able to understand what are the implications, how do we string these things together, and have a plan, right? So, we have plans all the way from the origin side, from the factory. We have a plan that says, all right, I'm going to move it from here. It's going to go on this thing, on this vessel, on this dray, and it should show up at this time. And then we're continually refining what our ETAs are as it progresses through so that we can make changes as far in advance as possible and limit the amount of disruption or unplanned labor or customer delays as possible, as soon as possible.
Very cool.
Hey, Eric.
Lots of
Eric. Hey,
yeah, go ahead,
can I
Jim.
just one comment? It's interesting listening to Brian speak about this. This is like aspirational state for so many supply chains, right? I listen to what Brian talks about, and these are clearly like cutting edge, great, ways to view the business. If you sort of step back and think about what Brian says for sort of like the everyman, right? Like every shipper, because not everybody's Wayfair, right? You're just like not everybody's Amazon or Walmart. I think the thing that I would take away from what Brian said is the forecast. Right? You'd be amazed how many companies of, shockingly sort of like great brands outwardly, you'd say like, oh, those guys definitely have this, have this handled, right? Don't forecast either at all or don't do it well. And I think in this environment, if you're as a supply chain practitioner, if you're under pressure to maintain service levels, mitigate costs, you should go back and say, where's my forecast? Because you're in a totally thankless job if you're not getting, and I know many supply chain folks feel like it's thankless anyway, but it's a no-win situation if you're being told to manage this situation and you get a crappy forecast or no forecast, right? And it's amazing how many companies I talk to say, oh, well, we just can't do it. Like, that's not good enough. And this is a great example of a time and place to make that case of forecast. And it's the fundamental piece of everything that Brian just talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, getting it onto the vessel is the most important thing, right? And so having that clear forecast so that you can secure that space is huge. Then you got a long journey, right? And so your forecast now is pre-populated. You know what's on the water. You have a couple of weeks to plan for it. And, as you said there, that gives you that window, but you got to get it on that vessel and you got to get that forecast. So you got to know what's coming out of the factory, what's projected to come out of the factory, and then start working those relationships to secure that capacity up front if you can.
Yeah. It's just so.
Yeah, I think Brian makes and Jim make great points. It's all about execution, right? So you can have all the visibility you want in the world, but it's all about execution, and your ability to get, as Brian just said, those containers booked and on the ship is increased dramatically if you know what's coming and when it's going to be ready, as opposed to expecting it's going to be ready based on what your original purchase order stated. So I think again we're back to visibility, but I think what Brian and Jim said is absolutely correct.
Yeah. Hey, just one thing, Eric. I hate to take this over. I want to add that we did an analysis on another customer. I can't name names, but I'll give you the visual. odds of you getting delayed at origin port if you book like 1 week out is like exponentially higher than if you book 3 or 4 weeks out. And ideally you're 4 weeks plus. Like the window you should be forecasting demand and trying to make commitments to carriers is like 4 to 6 weeks. You sort of lose, there's a diminishing return being longer than that. But it is like a hockey stick when you go up to like within 1 week. It's basically like trying to ask an ocean carrier to do an expedited shipment. It just doesn't work. So like if you can't plan your loads 2, 3, 4 weeks out, ideally 4, you're not doing your supply chain justice. And if somebody's telling you, or upstream, if they're creating that dynamic where you can't do that as a shipper, you should take that on. Like that's the root cause of the problem.
Yeah, really fantastic. The orientation of drilling into things really far upstream and getting really good at that to figure out when you can actually get your cargo to whatever your customer is, whether it's an end customer, internal, or a commercial customer. Really interesting. How do you go about, especially let's look at it in this environment, right? Like U.S. imports, forget about the Suez, just U.S. imports have been a mess for a long time now. How do you go about setting an accurate date for when a shipment is likely to be at a critical, delivered to a point that's critical? Do you set a date and work backward from there using systems to figure out approximately, what it normally takes and then layer on, dynamics of the moment? Is there some other way to calculate this? How do you go about doing that from a technology perspective? What's the system that kind of gives you that answer? And do you orient it, sort of from delivery backwards?
I mean, I think it's just evolving, right? It's ever evolving day to day in terms of just what factors you can take into play to understand and to try to predict, right? And so, like I said, we're starting to look at the number of ships or number of vessels that are sitting outside of port to see kind of like, what does the waiting line look like? How much delay do we think is going to incur, right? Because as soon as we can get to port, then it's relatively predictable. I mean, yes, the dray market is a little tight, but like we can get there. But that is not enough time for labor planning to happen at the warehouses for us. And so we have to make some guesses on the upstream. I think the one nice thing is that we, from a Wayfair perspective, is we have continual flow. And so it tends not to be, I can't tell you when this particular container is going to show up on that day, but there's a volume that are showing, and it's just a matter of like how many are going to show up, not which particular ones. And so, we're continually just refining it so that, honestly, as an organization, for us, it's a lot about that, our customer being the warehouse. How do we let them pre-plan? How do we make sure we're not causing backups there? How do we make sure the yard is clean? And ultimately, how do we get the goods into a sellable location so that people on the e-commerce side can actually buy those? And then, the same problem begins on the other side, which is how do we then get that out to the end customer?
Yeah, and those are linked, right? I mean, when the e-commerce folks are promising a sofa will be at a house by a certain date, they need to know what your time frame is, obviously. Yep. They can't just be guessing, and right. So, Simon, any thoughts on this? How do you sort of build that using your system?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said before is exactly right. We work with our clients to see or to understand what the cargo due date is at destination, right? And then work back from there, linking that together with, and again, I want to keep banging this drum, but PO management, when the cargo is going to be available at origin. So when do they need it at destination? When's it really going to be available at origin? And then, supply chain anyway, you have to be imaginative in the last 12 months, even more so. Look at the various routings, various port situations, drayage situations, as Brian alluded to as well, and try and plot the most appropriate routing in order to ensure you get that cargo due date at destination. But as far as the routing is concerned, we always start with when do you need it here by, right? And not like when's the next vessel or what vessel's coming up. It's like, when do you need it here by? And then let's play the puzzle of how do we get it there. And that's, that's a mix of technologies.
So we have about 5 minutes left. We have a few interesting questions that have come in. So let me try to address as many of those as we can over the next couple minutes. Interesting question around whether from the audience, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase it, but we've obviously seen a huge rise in SaaS software over the last decade, meaning software as a service. Generally, that means subscription pricing. Generally, it's supposed to mean easier onboarding. Has that been your experience, Simon, both from your perspective as a provider of technology and Brian as a consumer? Are you seeing it easier to test things out, to onboard customers, to be onboarded, to connect with other systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, nothing is really plug and play, or certainly not in my experience. But I think it is definitely getting easier, and integrations are getting easier, particularly with APIs. But yeah, from our perspective, I'm a big believer in collaborating and working with other technology providers to give that holistic view that Brian was talking about before, and that our clients absolutely crave, is that cradle to grave visibility of any particular order. And again, I don't think there's one provider that's going to deliver that. So you have to bring that all together, but give the customer a single source of where they can get that visibility. And that's certainly been our experience.
Yeah, interesting. Brian, as a consumer, are you seeing that?
Yeah, I mean, I would lean more in terms of what is the most valuable thing? I would say actually aggregators are much more valuable today than some of the, SaaS stuff, right? Because the SaaS stuff really comes down to the core, right? So if you need a full TMS system, a full, WMS system, ERP, whatever it is, and you have nothing today, well, that's easy. You can go with a SaaS software, you can get up and running. But I think as Simon alluded to earlier, it's only one thing to have a place to store the data. It's another thing about the data itself. And so, whether it's aggregating terminal data, carrier data, vessel tracking data, you never can get away with one source of data for whatever reason, right? Even ocean vessels and their carriers, their ETA to port is horrible, right? It hasn't been updated in years. The pandemic, they're just yeah, whatever. I'll just keep giving you the ETAs. And so I would say the biggest lever that we're seeing is actually some of these aggregators that are able to, instead of us having to go and integrate into all the ports and all the terminals in the US, we can go and work with third parties to be able to get a single source where they can lever their expertise as that, and we can focus on the logistics side of things and acting on that data versus spending our time trying to collect that data directly.
Yeah. Super interesting, and definitely an area that I've been tracking pretty intently. Jim, maybe you can wrap us up. One last question. Are you seeing, you talked a lot about shippers, obviously not all shippers can be at the head of the class, but are you seeing them sort of looking at SLAs either with their carriers or LSPs that are sort of digitally oriented? So completeness, timeliness of data, some of the things that Brian just referenced.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that there's, obviously a push that starts with Walmart, right, and works back through the supply chain to drive higher levels of performance from suppliers and the like. And so I think that's sort of ubiquitous now. But in this environment, I mean, all bets are off, right? I think that it's just, can you get me the space and get me from A to B is really what's on the mind of most shippers. But I think in steady state, I think there's certainly a push not only for carriers to provide better information, but to connect more seamlessly and be more a part of sort of the fabric of a shipper's supply chain and less transactional.
Yeah, and fair point. You're probably not going to be able to demand that your carrier gets you, pristine data at this point, right? So good reality check at this moment. right now. So, well, folks, we are out of time. I just wanted to go through a few wrap-up things, unanswered questions, and there were a few of them. We'll follow up by email on those. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today, our panelists, our audience, GenFlat Containers, Nightscope, NavTrack, Redwood Logistics, and SMC3 for sponsoring today's program. On behalf of the JOC and IHS Market, thank you so much for attending. And many thanks again to Jim, Simon, and Brian for an outstanding discussion today. I'm Eric Johnson. Have a great day.